So just to begin, good morning. My name is Anna Duncan. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a program operations specialist here at CoLab for Community and Behavioral Health Policy and the Evidence-Based Practice Institute. So on behalf of our team, I want to say thank you so much for being here this morning, bright and early on a Monday. We're really excited about our webinar today, which is focused on family-based, culturally responsive interventions in infant mental health care. So we will start with a land acknowledgement. CoLab for Community and Behavioral Health Policy and the University of Washington acknowledge that we gather on Indigenous land, the traditional territory of Coast Salish peoples, and specifically the Duwamish tribe. This ancestral land is unceded and must be returned. We also acknowledge that our work across the state takes place on the homelands of Native peoples who've lived in this region from time immemorial. Currently, there are 29 federally recognized and 7 non-federally recognized tribes within Washington state. We express our deepest respect for and gratitude towards these original and current caretakers of the region. As we move forward in advocating for and moving toward health and racial equity, let us remember that we're living in a history-driven present. Let us work to learn more about the histories, cultures, and traditions of Indigenous people and how we might build relationships with sovereign tribal nations and create more inclusive spaces that foster innovation, collaboration, and empowerment. We encourage you to consult native-land.ca to learn more about the land you are on and to pay rent through Real Rent Duwamish. The Duwamish tribe has yet to be justly compensated for their land, resources, and livelihood. And by paying real rent, you can do something today to stand in solidarity with the First Peoples of this land. All funds go directly to Duwamish Tribal Services to support the revival of Duwamish culture and the vitality of the Duwamish tribe. So before we begin today with our presentations, I'd just like to do some really brief Zoom housekeeping. So if you encounter any technical issues during the webinar or just want to express kind of a reaction or a thought to the presentations as we're going along, feel free to just use the chat box. I know that folks have already been saying good morning, saying hello, so we really welcome that and love to see folks engaging throughout the webinar. We will also have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so we just ask that you hold your questions till the end. And then lastly, for those of you who have attended our webinars before, we're trying out a new format today, which is basically a really big Zoom meeting rather than using the Zoom webinar format. So what this means is that it's a lot more interactive. You're able to have your camera on. You can unmute if needed to ask questions. But the idea with that is that we just ask that you're really mindful of staying muted if possible. We know that things come up and accidents happen, but just in an effort to try to make this feel more connected and community oriented where we can have our cameras on, there is also that added layer of having potentially being unmuted. So just know that we'll be monitoring that, and we really appreciate you all kind of thinking about that and being mindful of it. And lastly, just wanted to say again that we are recording this webinar, so just know that it's being recorded and that it will be uploaded to our website. So you can always watch if you miss anything or just want to watch it again. All right, and then lastly, at the end of the webinar, we'll send a link through the chat box for an evaluation survey. Please fill it out with any feedback you may have on the webinar. We love hearing from you to know how we can improve our webinars, feedback for our amazing presenters, just always looking for ways to improve, and also any thoughts on future webinar topics that you'd like to see. And additionally, we'll also be emailing out that survey link as well if you miss it in the chat. And also just one thing to note, so we aren't able to offer kind of specific CE, CME credits. However, we are offering kind of a broad certificate of completion at no cost to you. Sometimes you're able to trade that in for credit. So feel free to reach out to us once you finish the evaluation survey to get that certificate of completion. All right, so we're just going to briefly go over the attendee poll results really quickly to give a sense of who's in the virtual room with us. So I don't know if you all can see this or if it's just me, but it looks like we have about 62% of our participants. So we have 92 folks in the room right now who are in the mental health care field. And then smaller contingencies from advocacy, public health, the medical field, and then a few in policy and research. So it seems like we have a lot of folks doing kind of direct clinical care. So thank you so much for being here. We're super excited and hope this feels really relevant. Wonderful. Okay. So again, before we jump into our amazing presentations, just wanted to provide a really brief overview of CoLab, the organization that I'm coming from and who's hosting the webinar today. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, CoLab for Community and Behavioral Health Policy was founded in 2020 within the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health Sciences at the University of Washington School of Medicine. And so here at the CoLab, we really engage in community expertise and research evidence to spark creative and sustainable change in behavioral health policy and systems, particularly those involving youth and families and around behavioral health care. So we really believe that communities and systems have deep knowledge and expertise, and that those must be bridged and leveraged to promote effective, sustainable, and impactful community programs. And then I mentioned earlier, we house the Evidence-Based Practice Institute, which is within CoLab, which was established in 2007 by the Washington State Legislature to promote high-quality mental health care for kids and families. So as you can see today, we have 3 incredible presenters. And so I'll just name them briefly, and then I'm going to hand it off to them to introduce themselves as well to start the presentations. But first we have Nucha Isarawong, Abigail Bocanegra, and Haruko Watanabe. So I will now hand it off to Nucha, our first presenter. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see some familiar faces and names in the audience. I guess it's an audience this morning. I'm so happy to be here with you. Our presentation today is going to cover the topic of infant and early childhood mental health. So what does that mean? We will roughly cover prenatal through 5 years of age. That would be the population that we generally consider as a part of infant and early childhood mental health. So before I start, maybe a little bit about myself. Locating myself socially. Again, my name is Nucha Isarawong. I'm a queer, male identified father of a 17-year-old, soon to be college-bound dancer. I am of Thai descent. I'm a first generation, 1.5 generation US citizen and hold dual citizenship in Thailand as well. And I currently live and work on Duwamish territory. I think that, I was trained as a social worker and worked in the Part C early intervention known as ESIT here in Washington State for several years. Did most of my growing up in the Midwest in the Chicagoland area. Okay, so moving on to the presentation. The plan for our time together today, I'll be covering what is infant mental health, infant and early childhood mental health, and talking a little bit about the scope and the framework. Then I'll hand it over to Abigail Bocanegra, who will cover creative arts therapies with young children and their families. And then Haruko will share with you some stories about work from the field and what this might look like. And then we'll provide a little bit of updates from Washington State. I know that I saw a name actually from Washington State in the audience, so she might be able to help us out if we miss anything that she would like us to also include in that sharing. Let's see. Oops, next slide, please. I keep forgetting I'm not controlling. So what is infant mental health? I want to start off by saying that the term infant early childhood mental health has had some difficulty catching on. It has there's been some pushback around, what young children have mental health. What does that mean? We don't understand why young children could potentially have mental health in the way that we understand mental health. And so I think as I move through what infant and early childhood mental health means for our field, I would ask you to consider, are we identifying mental health for the general population, for young adults, for children, young adults, and for adults that we're providing services to, are we identifying and defining mental health in a way that actually is helpful and useful for those particular populations? Because we might need to reconsider that a little bit. So let's talk about infant and early childhood mental health. Next slide, please. So our field, which is a very multidisciplinary field, we're made up of medical professionals, including doctors, pediatricians, psychiatrists. We also have other licensed professionals such as occupational therapists, speech therapists, nutritionists, anybody out there in the world, including early care and education teachers, some nannies, doulas, midwives, anybody who works with families in the care of their children from the prenatal stages all the way through to age 5. So this doesn't mean that we're only addressing mental health issues or challenges that children and families might be experiencing. It means that that we offer a very, very wide range, and you'll see that in the scope of the work that we do. And so in our field, this very wide multidisciplinary field, we define infant and early childhood mental health as the developing capacity of infants and young children to experience, express, to regulate emotions, to experience, express, and regulate emotions, to form close and secure relationships, and explore the environment and learn in the context of cultural expectations. Now, this is the cultural expectation here is something to really focus on, because this is the larger, wider meaning of culture that we're utilizing. This isn't just about the traditions and holidays and things like that, the language. It includes all of those things, but we're talking about the larger, wider cultural expectations in which they grow up. So as you can see here, what we're talking about is the emotional experience, being able to regulate those emotions in service of being in relationship with caregivers so that they can explore and learn and develop forward. Next slide, please. So what we have is a particular focus that young children, infant and toddler and early childhood or preschool children develop within the context of relationships. And so the relationship is not only the holder of children's development, but a driver of children's development. A lot of times we talk about this and people really think about the relationships of caregivers that they have, such as parents, siblings, grandparents, aunts and uncles. We include all of those people and relationships. But as we continue to do more and more work in helping to understand children's developmental context, we also take into consideration the place and location in which children grow up. And the ways that children and people are connected to where they come from. We also think about the things, the toys, the furniture, the equipment, the home, the trees and gardens, all of those things that children are surrounded by in their developmental context that they are learning from because they are interacting with those things on a regular basis, on a daily basis in their lives. So what this means for us then as professionals who are focused on children's development within the relational context is that we're focusing a lot of our attention on that context, on that relational context. So on the caregivers and the well-being of the caregivers, because they are the human relational context for children. On children's homes to provide safety and shelter, on the availability of food, etc., because that is a part of children's developmental context. Next slide, please. We have lots of sayings that really help us to express why children develop in relationship, and this is one of them, that there's no such thing as a baby. There's a baby and someone. That babies are completely dependent on the care of caregivers, of the protectors of adults generally from the moment that they're born, and that they utilize their relationship with those caregivers as a way of moving themselves forward so that they can contribute and become a part of the community and continue to build on that relationship. So anything that affects that relationship, that relational context will potentially impact children's development moving forward. Next slide, please. So when we think about the scope of infant and early childhood mental health, what I like about this particular model, which comes from a book by Brandon Tronick, is that it's actually backwards, if you notice, that you have children, parents, and the relationship of children at the center, but that the very closest circle are promotional services. And promotional services are really the kinds of services that everybody should have access to, the universal types of services. And the reason that it looks this way, from promotion to prevention and to early intervention, pan-disciplinary services, to more discipline-specific services, and it's moving outward like that, is because we believe in the field of infant and early childhood mental health that children and families should have access to universal services first, prevention services next, and as the need become more specific, that's where we should be providing services. So, as the intensity of need, of challenges, of difficulties that the family might have, we radiate outward, and that specific disciplinary services should actually be one of the last resorts to be providing for families. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why I like this particular model as a way of explaining that, but to understand that we range the entire from promotion to very specific interventions that we provide, intensive specific interventions that we provide for families. Also, the other thing to take note of is that in the middle, that services are really wrapping around children, parents, and you see that those circles are overlapping, which means that we're also attending to the relationship between children and parents, children and other relationships, children in their environment, so that those things are within our consideration of how we consider and move forward in the perspective that we take to provide services for children and families. Next slide, please. One of the models that we utilize, if you're familiar or maybe you're not familiar with this, this comes from Arietta Slade's book in 2020. And she identifies this as the relational foundation of reflection. We're expanding a little bit on that to utilize it as a way of understanding the relational foundations of reflection, learning, exploration, and play. And that this model really applies not just to children and their developmental processes, but also to adults. That for professionals to engage with adults, we need to provide the very base of this triangle, beginning with the safety and trust. Because if adults and children are in the place of fear and in survival mode, they will have a very difficult time building relationship with anybody, including one another, as well as the professionals they work with. We also need parents and children to be regulated. If they're dysregulated, again, there's going to be lots of difficulties in building relationships. So with those two triangles in place, a safety, trust, and regulation, we can then rest attachment-based, attachment style relationships on those two foundations of safety, trust, and regulation. And when you have attachment-based relationships, then you can have space for reflection, learning, exploration, and play. So again, we're hoping to, as professionals, engage with parents, provide safety and trust and regulation for them so that they can reflect and explore. They then, in turn, we hope, within the parallel process, provide safety, trust, and regulation for their children to have that relational base to support children's learning, exploration, and play. Next slide, please. We also utilize what is one of the foundational perspectives in infant and early childhood mental health, which is psychoanalytic and psychodynamic perspectives. I bring in the community psychoanalytic, psychodynamic perspective because our foremother of infant and early childhood mental health, Selma Freiberg, practiced what was called kitchen table psychoanalysis. And what that is just a home visiting version, so that, the parent or the child isn't laying on a couch to get, analyzed. They're talking in the home, in a natural environment, to really understand the context of children and families. And community psychoanalysis and psychodynamic has evolved to be the balance between taking into consideration all of the interpersonal and intrapsychic internal aspects of individuals that we are working with, as well as children and parents. That includes children and parents, in balance with the social, economic, and political experiences that they are having in society. Experiences of systems of oppression like racism, sexism, classism, and other systems of oppression, being held in balance with the work that we're doing with individuals and their children. So psychoanalysis provides a context for us to be thinking about both the internal and external expressions of emotion, why individuals may engage in certain types of avoidance behaviors. And this is not pathological avoidance, it's actually survival naturalistic avoidance, because we all want to avoid stress. We all want to avoid adversity. We all want to avoid threat. So it's something that we do on a natural basis. How we do it is a whole other question. And there are ways for us to help to come to understand why parents and children may engage in some of these avoidant types of behaviors. Looking at themes of behaviors and in interactions and in relationships, thinking about the past and how that informs current day behavior and future outlooks, focusing on the interpersonal, the space in between individuals as a way of holding the space and environment, and the work of reflection and exploration, focusing on the caregiver and the professional's relationship as an important factor in doing the work. So regardless of whether you're a mental health clinician or if you're a child care professional, if you're engaging with the parents, we need to be holding that relationship, right? If we're caring for a child and we're engaging with the family, we need to hold the relationship with the parents for the benefit of that child. And then lastly, exploring dreams, hopes, fears, and desires that might be a driver or an underlying type of either driver or challenge for the family or the caregiver in the care of their child. Next slide, please. And so this diagram really gets at how we hold the work that we do. So you see the caregiver and the child with their overlap. We attend to that overlap, the relationship between the caregiver and the child. But when we become a part of the relationship, and this could be multiple caregivers, so just keeping that in mind, when we become a part of this system of work, we're then attending to the relationship that we have with the caregiver, that we might have with the child, and then the ways that our relationship intermingle and intersects with one another, so that we can hold that space for the parent and the child to develop and work on the ways that they are with one another. The things outside are considerations around what are the program, organization, and system of care history, perspectives, and what it's bringing into the work that we do. What are the forces that is pushing us to approach that work in a particular way? We also want to take into consideration the family and our own social, cultural, economic, and political context and setting. What do we believe? Where are we in our social identities? What are our economic experiences and how they might be the same or different than the family that we work with? And of course, taking those things into consideration, we also have to take into consideration systemic inequities that are a part of social, cultural, economic, and political contexts. So racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, heterosexism, xenophobia, ableism, you name it, we need to take them into consideration in terms of how they have impacted our lives as well as the lives of the children and families we work with. Next slide, please. So this is just a way to help us understand. This comes from University of Washington School of Nursing's very own Monica McLemore, a new faculty member that we are so excited to have as a part of the nursing school. But this really says that if we're familiar with the idea of social determinants of health and well-being. And this really says that social determinants of health and well-being don't drop out of the sky. It comes from someone. And and of course, then it leads to psychological distress and potentially unhealthy behaviors, right? If you live in a food desert, you're not going to make good nutritional decisions because you don't have the opportunity to make good nutritional decisions. If you live in a low healthcare service area, you're going to have a hard time making decisions about going to see and engaging in preventative medicine because you don't have access to it. So our decision making is really based on the opportunities that we might have based on these social determinants of health. And then, of course, we see at the bottom the disparities in distribution of disease, illness, and well-being that are there for children and families alike. If you go upward, though, social determinants of health are a result of policy decisions in the labor market, in housing policy, in education system. All of these things are policy decisions. And that those policy decisions exist in the ways that they do, going up one level, because of institutional racism, class oppression, and gender discrimination and exploitation, as well as other systems of oppression. So this is a way of understanding how the systemic inequities that exist in our society really trickles down into where we see the disparities in the distribution of disease, illness, and well-being. This is the model that we utilize in infant and early childhood mental health to help us understand the context in which children and families live in. Next slide, please. So as a way of helping us, that was my alarm, sorry about that. As a way of helping us to hold on to an understanding and really center our attention to those systemic inequities, those systems of oppression, the field of infant and early childhood mental health had some of the leaders within the field had come together to think about what may be the central principles and tenets of infant and early childhood mental health. And they arrived very quickly that they can't talk about central tenets and principles of infant and early childhood mental health without the full integration of an understanding of how systems of oppression impacts the lives of children and families in the work of infant and early childhood mental health. And so the diversity-informed tenets for work with infants, children, and families was developed. This is version 2.0. It used to be the diversity-informed tenets for infant mental health. But we recognize, it's been recognized now that these tenets are actually more applicable for older kids, for any kind of work that we're engaged in, family work that we engage in. There are 10 tenets. The handout is in the chat for you to take. They are in English and in Spanish for you to explore, to think about, to reflect on, and hopefully to bring in as a discussion for you and your colleagues as a part of your own thinking about how you might hold diversity, equity, and inclusion as a part of the work that you do. Next slide, please. The tenets utilizes tenet number 1 as its core principle. And its core principle is around self-awareness, leading to better services for children and families. I'm going to read this. I know I'm going to be a little over time, but I'm going to try to go quick. Working with infants, children, and families require all individuals, organizations, and systems of care to reflect on our own culture, values, and beliefs, and on the impact that racism, classism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, xenophobia, and other systems of oppression have had on our lives in order to provide diversity-informed, culturally attuned services. This means that we need to be aware of what we're bringing to the relationship that we are engaging in with the children and families that we serve. It means that we have to be aware of the biases, the implicit, unconscious notions that we bring into that work. What is valuable to us might not match the values and beliefs of the family, and that could potentially lead to disruption, ruptures within the relationship, and decision makings that we make that could potentially impact children and families at a much broader, wider level. Child welfare being one of those decision-making points that we may have. Next slide, please. And one of the central concepts as a part of the tenet number 1 is diversity-informed practice. And this helps us think about the ways that we engage and interact with children and families. That diversity-informed practice recognizes historic and contemporary salience, the importance of historic and contemporary salience of racism, classism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, xenophobia, and other systems of oppression, so that we can strive for the highest possible standard of inclusivity in all spheres of practice. And of course, all sphere of practice is not just direct services, but includes teaching and training, research and writing, policy and advocacy as well. Next slide, please. So thank you. That's the end of my section, and I will turn it over to Abigail to share with you her work.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nucha, for that wealth of information on infant and early childhood mental health and diversity-informed practices. I feel like this is a nice kind of segue into using creative arts with children and families, because there's a component here in which we're going to review about cultural approaches to using the expressive arts. And so today we're going to move into an approach that I use as a fundamental practice in my work with children and families. It really is just one, but I often integrate it with other models or interventions that are relationally and culturally based. But for today's presentation, we'll focus on the utilization of different arts modalities through a trauma-informed lens with young children 0 to 6 and their families. Next slide, please. So a little bit about me, I'll quickly kind of go through this. So I started my relationship with the arts at a very young age. I was about 2 or 3 years old, and I was a very quiet child, and the arts really kind of gave me more of a self-soothing experience at the time, and something, a way to emote my internal experiences, as I would often internalize a lot of what the world around me would present and what I would bring into my body. And several decades later, with my personal stories, my grandmother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And so in this journey, I was researching ways in which that we could help her develop a higher quality of life as she was losing her capacity to speak English and Spanish. And so, and all I was really finding was just more Western medical approaches around medication that was exacerbating her symptoms of Alzheimer's. But then after all that research, I found some interesting data on music and the expressive arts therapies and Alzheimer's. It was really fascinating because as I was using music or finding case studies in which those with Alzheimer's were listening to music and singing and dancing, there was a certain amount of quality of life that they were living and an ability to communicate that was different than using the verbal word. And so this is exactly what happened with my grandmother. And that's kind of what shifted my practice from just being an artist or going to art school into then pursuing my graduate's degree in expressive arts therapy through the California Institute of Integral Studies, where I learned the foundations and principles of expressive arts. But really, once I graduated, working with families really kind of allowed me to understand the importance of nonverbal therapies, especially for families of color, because I noticed that when I began earlier in my career, a lot of families had decided or requested to not do a lot of talk therapy, but more experiential-based practices that could heal trauma or to help them express what was happening inside more from a culturally relevant experience. Next slide, please. So what I'll intend to offer you today is some basic information on what creative arts therapy is, cultural foundations and implications of the creative arts practices, the importance of process-oriented arts practices through a neurobiological lens within the context of the parent-child relationship. And lastly, if we have time, I'll review a case of a young mom and her son engaging in the healing arts as a journey into healing. And if we're not able to get to that case, I do have some examples that can help kind of ground you in the application of the arts in parent-child dyads. Next slide, please. So what are the creative arts, and how do we use it in therapy? And so really, the creative arts is an inclusion of purposeful application of a variety of modality of art. So this can be visual, this can be poetry, this can be dance, music, sound, dramatic enacting, it can be ritual and ceremony, and all within a psychotherapeutic framework. So the arts here, when we're using it in this framework, they're highly experiential, very active and engaged children and families on multisensory levels. So today I'm going to focus on the application, again, with children 0 to 6 in the context of neuroscience and psychobiology. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are two components here to children and their relationship to the arts that are fundamental to this approach. And so one is of language and the other of social cultural applications. What I love about the creative arts and their healing power is that it's really the preferred language of children, since many of our children 0 to 6 are not quite verbal or are still just learning how to express themselves verbally. The arts really engage in their senses while they're immersed in play and support the development of cognition, social emotional development, verbal expression, and multi-sensory skills that allow them to kind of sensory integrate with themselves and also in the world around them. The other component here that's really important to the arts is the cultural implications to it. So in many cultures, there really is no word for art because it is that integral to life itself. It not only helps the child and family, but the entire community, and the arts is usually experienced not just in the parent-child dyad, but together in community to honor important life transitions, like honoring children as they go through rites of passages, like at age 3, at age 5, at age 13 and 15 and 18, and so on. The arts can be used to celebrate certain natural seasons or cycles in nature. And this is where we really start to see the cultural concept come through of interconnectedness for diverse families, where the healing through the arts extend beyond the child and parent dyad and the family and really move out into the family system, the community, society at large, and in the world. This linguistic and cultural framework really embodies the purpose of utilizing child-centered and social cultural lens integrated in the arts and psychotherapy. And we'll see certain examples in the presentation later. Next slide, please. So here I'd like to share Bruce Perry's neurosequential model. I'm sharing this because it's a model that's developmentally informed. It's a biological approach to working with children that parallels the arts experiences that we're going to review. It's not a specific therapeutic intervention, but a way to organize a child and parents' history and current functioning. So the overall goal of this approach is really to structure an assessment and parent to really understand the symptoms, the key strengths of that relationship, and the application of therapeutic interventions in a way that helps families and therapists meet the needs that are there developmentally and psychobiologically. So we'll take a brief look. We've taken a brief look at the creative arts therapy as an approach. But with trauma-informed creative arts therapy, the neurosequential model really integrates neurodevelopmental knowledge and the sensory quality of the arts in trauma interventions. This can be really helpful when working with families who's experienced attachment ruptures or traumas in early relationships, which is going to be the focus of today's presentation. And in attachment work, emphasis is placed on arts-based experiences that reinforces that sense of safety that's so critical to the work through reconnection to positive attachment to self and to others, beginning at the sensory level, which you'll see starts at the brainstem and the diencephalon. Next slide, please. So what happens when we layer the neurosequential model with an expressive arts continuum model? So first, to define the expressive arts continuum, it's a concept that was initially proposed and published in 1978 by art therapist Sandra Kagan and Vija Loosbrink to understand the development in the arts in children and families. And within this integration, we now have a framework that focuses on the process of neurodevelopment interweaved with creative arts modalities. And therapists will essentially, with this chart, essentially seek to match therapeutic and healing experiences to the physiological needs, developmental stages, the interests of the parent and child dyad within the context of family cultural values and practices through a trauma-informed lens. Next slide. So what's important to note here is to remember that the stress response, as you saw on the charts, really begins at the brainstem and diencephalon within the first 3 years of life, beginning and prenatally. And to address the safety and sensory components of the child, the arts interventions will likely be more effective in gaining calm and receptivity of a parent-child in the session to be able to reach higher brain functions. Here we have Perry, again, Bruce Perry, who promotes the 6 R's in the planning and implementation of therapeutic interventions that are experiential and culturally relevant to process from the sensory experience all the way to cognition. Next slide, please. So in the early phases of treatment, whatever arts practices is used, whether it be clay or drawing or blocks, safety within the parent-child relationship is crucial. And on the onset of therapy, it's highly likely that I get children and families or parents that come into therapy and they're highly anxious, not knowing what to expect. Sometimes children are really happy to be with their parents in the session, to have that special time with them. And other times they're really scared of who's in the room with them and do not trust any kind of relational processes through the arts with that parent. And so the primary need here for me is to start to begin to really allow for a calm down of the regulatory system. And this happens in the context of relationship while engaging the parent and the child in play. And sometimes that play and that art experience can be parallel, and sometimes it can be done together depending on the level of safety that is within the relationship. So some of the examples of this kind of engagement could be drawing, helping the parents and child choose a very small piece of paper with a very structured medium like a pencil or a colored pencil and just start drawing together. It doesn't have to be anything specific, just a form of expression. They can play music together. So I'd often have musical instruments in my room of drumming and shakers, flutes, just so they can explore the sensory qualities of the arts. In the context of establishing safety at the beginning of therapy. This can also look like blowing bubbles and catching them, throwing a ball back and forth to really enhance that serve and return, or at least what it looks like between parent and child in the beginning. And then really balancing the holding of their process, following their lead and their play, but then also providing more spontaneous play art activities that can initiate some of that engagement and receptivity that we often don't see with families at the beginning. So really anything that we can provide through the arts as long as the parent and child are enjoying the process. So here are a few examples of some arts experiences that children made with their parents. Here up on top, we have a wood container. This wood container was created by a little boy. He was about 5 years old, and he loved Minecraft. And so he would build these fortresses of wood blocks. And I remember in the first sessions, he'd come in and build this and then put a little block in the middle. And when I asked him what that little block in the middle was doing there, he said that was him, that it's me. and that it's my safest place in here and nobody else is in here but me. And so this little boy had a pretty extensive history in his infancy and early childhood of severe abuse and neglect by his mother, and then was placed with his grandmother and his biological father, and had a real hard time with just making any kind of connection and relationship with adults. And so beginning therapy looked like this for him, and then we would move out in the work from that place. The Lego container here was done by a 6-year-old boy and his mother. They created it together. This little boy lost his infant baby sister just a year before coming to therapy. And so there was a lot of grief and loss that was presenting in the room between him and his mother. And this Lego structure ended up representing kind of like a time capsule of all the memories that they had with his infant sister and his mother. And it was kept safe in this container in their room for the majority of treatment and until he was able to move into something different. And the clay container here was done by a young woman and her mother who were separated for years and then brought back together. And this little girl this young woman had put a ball and a stick in the middle, which represented her and her mother establishing a new relationship again after that rupture. And so these containers typically in the arts practice would stay in the therapy office for because the externalization of strong affect is usually held within the art process itself and the art outcome. So I would often give them a choice, my clients a choice of leaving it here or taking it home. And oftentimes it was just leaving it in the office. And it was a helpful way of providing emotional distancing from traumatic material and for them to have a healthy agency in choice to return to the material when it felt most tolerable to do so. Next slide, please. So in the application of expressive therapy continuum, what's important to obtain here is the assessment of the developmental phase and when the trauma happened in that phase. So in the therapy space, I often have a variety of art and play materials that are designed for certain developmental phases. I usually allow the child to choose freely and play with art materials because children are often very smart and attuned and intuitive into to knowing what they need to move forward and create space in their bodies for their healing. So a 6-year-old might choose finger painting if trauma occurred around 1 or 2 years of age. A 9-year-old might choose a dollhouse and play out the trauma that happened when they were 5. So it's really important to have a variety of art materials accessible for the kids and the families without assuming that if a 8 or a 6 or a 5-year-old come into the office that they're at that age chronologically, but developmentally they're needing something different. And so we have here the sensory kinesthetic, the affective, perceptual, and cognitive symbolic levels of the expressive arts therapy continuum. And we'll go into them a little bit more fully. Next slide, please. So here we have some play arts examples to engage parents and children in the session. So we have the sensory kinesthetic level that targets the brainstem. Nothing here in this level is made in specific. So the arts really shouldn't focus on outcome or aesthetic qualities rather than the process of art making and awakening the senses in the body and bringing clients into the present moment to be able to start to build that relationship and that secure attachment through the conduit of the arts. And so sensory play really takes place with a variety of mediums. So this can be outdoor experiences. I often take children and parents outdoors and I connect them with earth, soil, tree bark, water from the river or lake, and all can help enhance presence in the dyad and that relationship. There's also movement in this level. We know that a child's first sensory experience is learning, and it's through movement in the utero. So movement is our first perception and can be mimicked at birth. And in the first years through swinging in a hammock, rocking, singing, drumming, all of this can reinforce the lower brain regions and provide that first felt experiences of co-regulation and secure attachment relationship. And with these rhythmic experiences, there's an association that happens with children that all is okay in the world, that I'm balanced and that I'm calm in the context of a person that I love, in the context of relationship. So I had a 6-year-old come in at one point, and was referred to me by his grandmother, and he was with his grandmother. She was primary caregiver. He experienced quite a bit of neglect and abuse in his earliest years. They were both identified as First Nations, and he had some extensive in utero exposure to substances with his mother. And so when he first came in, he was very highly anxious, rummaging through all the materials, quickly and aggressively throwing things. And I moved him and his grandmother to a culture-specific arts practice just to explore and get curious about. And I brought in the drums and prompted him to bang the drum and titrate the sound and the intensity and the rhythm of the drum while I had grandmother attuned to his titration of sound and intensity in drums. So slow meant slow attunement, fast meant fast attunement. And this was really able to engage his sensory and kinesthetic levels, where he was able to calm his nervous system and then engage in more receptive play with his grandmother. Next slide. So we have affective and perceptual level here, which focuses on the emotional brain. So what we want here is we want the arts to enhance emotional intelligence in children and parents. This can be done through identifying different emotions through mask making, drawing of facial expressions, bringing an actual mirror into the session to help children and parents become more self-aware of what's happening in their face and in their bodies. Families can engage in role play in this level, focusing on parts work by addressing different parts of the self and finding sound or movement or voice to those different parts. Music is also a powerful conduit to healing. It's a very emotive tool and brings out affective qualities that have been stuck and not fully integrated into the body with early relational trauma. It can also act as a container when the feelings get too big in the parent-child dyad, and music can kind of help contain those experiences. Body mapping can help with visually orienting to physical sensations and emotions in the body, especially when a parent or child feels disconnected from their body and are mostly in their mind. When they see it externally, it kind of helps evoke that process of body-mind integration. I will share with you an example of a 4-year-old that came to me. He was adopted by his mother, who was from Denmark, and they were initially referred because mother was from Denmark and she had very different parenting practices than here in the United States, where she would allow her baby to sleep outside in the colder weather and her children to spend 2 to 4 to 5 hours a day playing, where then a CPS call was made because of the misunderstanding of her cultural and parenting practices. But so that was a layer already on top of her adopting her 4-year-old son, in which we would engage in session in art making through plaster of Paris. And so part of the work was helping mom kind of express herself in competent ways as a parent, working with her child on developing kind of more of a secure attachment through the sensory experience of plaster of Paris, and then her son taking off the mask and painting it in regards to how he was feeling, whether it was happy or sad to be in relationship with his mother. And that helped with the affective and perceptual processes in the session. And then next slide, please. And then the last here, we have the cognitive symbolic level, which focuses on the cortical areas of the brain. So this is really bringing that emotional work from the limbic area into the context of narration and meaning making. We see creative decision making when focusing on problem solving during play and art making. And this process then extends out to real life scenarios and situations for the child and the parent. We have storytelling. When we're looking at the neurobiological benefits of storytelling, we see that stories provide a kind of like this narrative vessel for emotionally laden stories. And this can help children and families feel like they can tolerate the pain of the stories a little more when they're remembering them. Telling stories also helps develop the links between the lower limbic areas and the higher structures. And we see this in the form of increasing communication, integration of brain neural networks, and allowing emotions to be felt without being completely hijacked by them. So the goal here is to really kind of integrate, right, all of these levels through arts and play experiences in the context of parent-child relationships to be able to strengthen attachment, secure relationships within parents and children. And here we can see that there was I had a child that came in. This is the last story that I'll share. She was about 9 years old, but really developmentally, she was about 2 years old, and came from Guatemala with her mother just several years prior, and had a lot of immigration trauma and a lot of just trauma in general, and acclimating and acculturating to the United States culture. And we, in our work together, we ended up using kind of the season of the Day of the Dead and Dia de los Muertos, which was culturally relevant for them, to experience and to express feelings of loss, of leaving their home country, and that loss and that fragmentation really affecting their parent-child relationship. And so through ceremony, through altar making, through the sensory experiences of flowers, of candles, and in telling stories with all of those visuals there present, really allowed mom and this little one to develop a secure relationship where they were able to talk about those losses and then move forward in a different way. So that concludes my session. I have a story, but I think I'm out of time. So we can move into our last slide here. And then I will move it and over to Haruko Watanabe.
Thank you, Abigail. Thank you, Nucha, for setting the frame for us, and Abigail for sharing about the application of creative arts therapy work for young children. Hi, everybody. My name is Haruko Watanabe, and I'm originally from Japan, where I grew up, and I draw upon my immigration experiences and identity in my work. So I just wanted to mention that. And I'm a Washington State trainer for an intervention called Child Parent Psychotherapy, which I will share about today through a story. I'm also a program manager at Novos Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Program in King County, where we have a variety of services from promotion, prevention, early intervention, and treatment. Nucha set the kind of frame for us earlier. Today, I wanted to build on what Nucha and Abigail have shared and introduce you to Jayla and her mother, Danielle, as a way to illustrate the critical ways that caregivers, parents, help young children recover following a traumatic event or stressful events. Let's see, next slide, please. So let us begin. Jayla is a 34-month-old African-American child who was referred to our infant mental health services by her daycare center with various concerns about Jayla's behavior in recent weeks. Mother Danielle is frustrated about having been called out of work to pick her daughter up early whenever Jayla hit and bit peers, or when she apparently cried inconsolably when her favorite teacher called in sick and didn't show up at the usual time. Daycare teachers also reported that Jayla has not been quite like her usual happy self lately, and that she's been having a hard time settling down at nap time. Danielle has noticed Jayla has been more irritable than usual and follows me everywhere. She freaked out when she heard ambulances. One crucial information Danielle wanted the infant mental health therapist to know was that Jayla's father recently died while Jayla was in his care. Next slide, please. So CPP here stands for Child Parent Psychotherapy, which is an intervention model for children aged birth to 5 years who have experienced traumatic events or are experiencing mental health, attachment, or behavioral problems. I would like for us to hold the story of Jayla and her family using the CPP triangle, which is a tool that we use to hold our case conceptualization. I'm going to go quickly to explain each component. So on the left-hand side of the triangle, the orange line that you see here, we acknowledge the child's experience. What has the child been through? This helps open the door to the experience or give permission to speak about or play about without overwhelming the child or the we know that even simply acknowledging what happened to the child may bring relief for the child and the caregiver. On the right-hand side of the triangle, for you, I think it's like blue teal color, we acknowledge the behavior and emotions and how they are connected to experience. And then green on the bottom line, the bottom of the triangle, is what we will jointly do in our work with the family. For example, we focus on safety. We help the caregivers to reclaim their place in the child's life as support dyadic affect regulation between the child and the caregiver. We support body-based regulation because we know our bodies can carry what happened to us. And we help adults hold and bear witness to the child's experiences so that they can help the child make meaning of those experiences. And we often call this a CPP triangle, but I wanted to highlight the circle around the triangle as well, because it's so important. This is how we hold the hope and the family strength. The things can change for the better. And that we are really going for the healing or long-term healing. Part of the work is also really rediscovering long forgotten inner resources and wisdom that exist within the family's culture. Next slide, please. So let's take a look for Jayla. So within CPP, Child Parent Psychotherapy, we look at the connection between the child's behavior and the feelings. Let's see, so that's a blue line on the screen, and their experience, the orange line. We call this a bridge of understanding. We try to connect those. Providers in the audience may be familiar with the famous SAMHSA phrase, it's not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. So we're holding that in mind. So on the right-hand side for Jayla, what the daycare teachers and mom are concerned about Jayla's behavior. So this is what we know at the time of the referral. So lately, Jayla has been, irritable. She cries a lot, hits peers. She's clingy. She may be scared of ambulances based on mom's observation, loss of joy, and she seems to have stopped napping at daycare. And on the left-hand side, we ask ourselves, what has Jayla been through? These are some of the, some of the key questions in the assessment process. What we know from the referral information is that Jayla's parents had separated, and then subsequently that the father died while Jayla was in his care. Notice I put a big green question mark on the left-hand side of the triangle. That's because there is still a lot at the time of the referral that we don't know about Jayla's experiences. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah. So we take time with our initial assessment to gather information and learn about the child and the important people. I wanted to mention, we'll get to this hopefully at the end, but in Washington State, we are now allowed up to 5 intake assessment before the diagnosis has to be given for Medicaid clients 5 years old and younger. And I'm sharing this slide as just one example of how those 5 sessions may be used to gather information that will help with the clinical case formulation. So if you take a look at the green circles from 1 to session 5, that gives you some kind of some ideas. In addition, actually, let's keep going. To the next slide, please. Through the process of assessment, Jayla's therapist learned more about the family's history. So Jayla and Danielle had moved in with a maternal grandmother several months ago when Danielle and Jayla's father separated. The mother has been less than enthusiastic about having to move back in with her own estranged mother in the house that she grew up in. During one of the initial home visits, we often do CPP in home visiting, therapists noticed old photographs of Danielle as a child and asked her what it was like to be back in the house that she grew up in. Danielle said, "I know my mom means well, but seeing these old photos is hard. She even kept some of the toys I had as a child and brought them out for Jayla to play with." So many memories, not all are good ones. During the assessment phase, the initial assessment phase, Danielle shared that Jayla's father had long been struggling with substance use, and the couple's fight had often escalated out of control. Moving out was a way to keep Jayla and me safe, but he didn't take it so well. The father had overdosed. I really shouldn't have let him take her that day. Next slide, please. So in CPP, we try to learn about the caregiver's history as well. It's often important to support the caregiver in metabolizing their own history as a way to free the child from the burden of this story from the past. Understanding the caregiver's history helps us make sense of the way that the caregivers are showing up, both in therapy visits as well as how they are responding to the child. And we are able to better support them if they are activated in the session by child's behaviors and play. Next slide, please. So just as we would for the young child, we look for connection between the caregiver's experience and their behaviors and feelings as well, including the parents' caregiver's responses to the children. Danielle had shared that she feels guilty for not having been able to protect Jayla from losing her father, having grown up with her own father out of much of her life. Danielle had really wanted to make sure that Jayla had her father in her life. And the being back in the childhood home brought back memories of her own parents fighting when she was little, how she used to hide in the closet, how she as a young child was always worried at bedtime because nighttime was often when her parents' fight escalated. And she worried that either the mom or dad would get hurt or be gone in the middle of the night. Next slide, please. In CPP, we make space for wondering about the larger historical trauma of a cultural group that may have impacted the family as well. Nucha and Abigail have referenced this, so I won't go too much into this, but we seek to understand, for example, how some behavioral patterns and ways of responding to emotions may have been adaptive, given the historical trauma experienced by some cultural groups. We also think about how we might acknowledge how the history between the therapists and the family's racial cultural groups may influence safety, therapeutic safety. How is it for example, for Jayla's family to be served by a white home visitor who is also a mandated reporter. Right? How might we as clinicians earn the right to family story? Next slide, please. So, boy, I'm going to whiz through. Knowing that you're going to get the slides, I wanted to let you know if you could go back real quick to the last slide. Yeah, so this will show you the more fuller version of the triangle on the circle that the mother and the clinician were able to come up with. Next slide, please. Young children often need toys to connect to their experiences or other nonverbal ways to begin communicating about what happened. And Abigail talked about this in the modality that she shared. In CPP, we often think of therapist task to learn how to speak play. So that's like a core competency of learning about use of play as a modality in Jayla's case, therapists worked really hard with Danielle to choose some key toys that may help Jayla play about the experiences she had. Some of those were, for example, ambulances, a doctor's kit, baby dolls or animals. Scary creatures are often key, so that some of those themes can be allowed in the play. Let's keep going. This is just a real quick overview of some of the main trauma-related competencies that we use in our work with young children. Some of the things that's quite unique in infant mental health work is this idea of supporting a dyad, supporting the relationship, balancing the clinician balancing attention between the mother, Danielle, and Jayla, and tracking both during the session was some of the things that the therapist worked on a lot. We also translate between the mother and Jayla's experiences. For example, when Jayla would anxiously follow her mother everywhere around the house, Danielle would strongly encourage independence in Jayla, and Danielle was also, of course, overwhelmed as well. They were both frustrated and hurt. Each had different, agenda, different needs. So the therapist worked to name how Jayla was needing connection with mom to feel safe. So that's Jayla's needs, because she worried that mommy would go away too, just as other important people have gone away, and how therapists also highlighted how mom needed to raise Jayla to be strong and independent person who could survive through many things given their experiences in social cultural context. Next slide, please. Okay, let's see. I wanted to mention this because I just recognize some of you in the audience, some of your names in the audience, and give plugs in for mental health consultation work in Washington State. So I just wanted to mention something here that's relevant for you all. One of the interventions for Jayla was at her daycare center. Infant mental health clinician visited and observed Jayla at the daycare and offered consultation to the teachers. The therapist helped Jayla's important grown-ups, including the daycare teachers, all understand Jayla's behaviors in the context of her experiences and developmental needs. By building this bridge of understanding, the therapist worked to help the teachers shift from, gosh, what's wrong with you, kid, to oh, it makes sense that you're sad and worried. You've lost one of your important people, right? So meaning making. Or that your grown-ups in your life have been stressed and angry and sad lately. It makes sense that you're anxious. Right? So that was a critical example of an example of critical work done with Jayla. Next slide, please. We often like to think in metaphors in CPP, and we think of trauma can be like an ugly dark cloud in that it hangs over you. But this picture shows the parent and therapist pushing aside the clouds, reminding us that even though CPP is a trauma treatment, the overarching goal is to support healthy development. Next slide, please. And it was very important for JLS infant mental health therapists to continue holding the hope with Danielle that change and growth are possible, and that Danielle can respond to Jayla in ways that she had wanted her mother to do when she was a young child, and that what happened to them didn't define them or determine their path forward. I wanted to, next slide, please. I think I will end here just to say that for Jayla's therapist to be present and effective, she really needed to be held and supported in regular reflective supervision as well, where she was able to slow down and notice what it was like for her to work with this particular family. Nusha had shared earlier about the tenets and diversity from tenet and tenet number one. Self-awareness leads to better services to families, and this is how critical it is for infant mental health therapists to have protected and regular space where they can be supported in digging deeper into that. I wanted to highlight that. I will end there. Let's see. I know that there is also a slide after this one, Joanne, that lists some updates. I think I wanted to say, I've mentioned this, but I also wanted to make sure that we have time for Q&A. So let's, will the link be embedded when the handouts? Okay, so we encourage you all to take a look at these critical system level updates at Washington State level, including the up to 5 intake appointment that I mentioned in my presentation that has to do with House Bill 1325. So take a look, and any of us here can be contacted to answer any more questions. So let's pause there for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much to our amazing presenters. So I know that we just have about 10 minutes left, 9 minutes left now. So we're going to do some kind of rapid fire Q&A, and we also really welcome questions kind of after the fact. There's a slide after this where we kind of repeat the contact information for our incredible presenters. You're always welcome to reach out with additional questions. So I think what we'll start with, so folks just want to put questions in the chat. We will start with, I just saw one question so far. And that was from Christy, and they had asked, what is the evidence base for creative art therapies?
Yeah, so there's been quite a bit of studies done over the last, let's say, decade or so. We have Dr. Kathy Malchiotti, Dr. Bruce Perry, Stephen Porges, and Judith Robin, who really have been kind of delving into the arts practices for children and families. And a lot of the research has been kind of empirically based, usage-based on what happens for children and families when they're engaging in the arts. A lot of Dr. Bruce Perry has really kind of been the one who's brought in more of the neurosequential model into the arts, and really kind of focusing on rhythm and sensory experiences through the arts and through eco arts therapy, which is also kind of something very popular and happening for kiddos and their families. And so he has extensive research on what actually happens within the nervous system, what happens at the cellular level and in the brain when certain art materials are engaged by children and families in certain parts of the treatment. And so I would highly recommend reading into some of those studies. A neurosequential model is a good place to start, which I kind of just briefly overviewed. And then we have Dr. Kathy Malchiotti, who also shares a lot. That she's dedicated 20 to 30 years of her life's work into the arts practices and how to bring it into more evidence evidence-based practice rather than usage-based practices. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Abigail. I don't know if Nutra, Haruka, you have any other additional thoughts?
I don't. I don't have anything to add in terms of the creative arts therapies. I think I would put out there just a question of what is it that we consider to be evidence-based practices. And I think that evidence-based has been privileged in a particular way in our work and in our field. I know for a fact that, well, my fact, I guess, that clinicians bring in a lot of practice wisdom in the work that they do. We integrate a lot of knowledge and a lot of research that are out there, basic research, developmental research, into the work that we do, pulling all of those pieces together because research can't keep up with everything that it is that we're trying to do and the population that we're trying to serve. So just to keep in mind, you know, what is the evidence that we're privileging in the work that we do and in our field.
Thank you so much. So if anyone has other questions that you either want to ask verbally, feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. We'll just kind of continue to hang out for a few more minutes. If there are any other questions, leave a little bit of space for those.
Bob. Go ahead, Bob.
See if I can get it. Yay, unmuted and maybe even video on and off. Okay, there we go. Can you guys even see me?
I see a chair.
Oh,
Office.
we are on. I don't know why it's not looking at me, but in any case, oh, okay. It's coming out the other side of my laptop.
There you are.
Hello.
I work in a wonderful child and family agency office, and I often come to these wonderful conversations that show all sorts of wonderful things that I would love to implement into my practice, and then often find that it is difficult within just the realities of the restrictions that we face in a Medicaid serving office, even though we have wonderful supervisors who I believe in a lot of this and are here with us even right now. And I would love to find a great conversation on what have people found as really creative and effective ways to integrate some of this into a day where you're seeing clients back to back. Doing a lot of art pieces becomes a very logistic nightmare sometimes when you're seeing people. So I'm just wondering if there's ideas from experience on how people integrate this into the reality of the logistic situations that we work in.
Just for clarification, are you asking integrating the modalities like CPP and creative arts or infant mental health type of work in general into day-to-day?
I was thinking more in terms of the artistic creative pieces that we work on. And yeah, just even, you know, I'm thinking already of asking, yeah, I would like to get blocks back into my office again. That's an easy one-step piece that's going to be great. Some more Legos, because I love doing Lego stuff as well with my kids. I've done it for a long time. Some of the other, you know, some more clay. You know, these are pieces that we can integrate, but I'm just wondering, just logistically, you start getting into more expansive art therapies. It seems like there needs to be a lot of extra care and time put into preparing and cleaning up and planning and talking with supervisors about your own emotional reactions, your own, how are you logistically going to take care of these items. So I often feel like, yeah, I'm inspired, but then I come back and I'm like, how do I really integrate this into my work? I'm just wondering if you guys have experienced this, you know, without let's say maybe a special university-based program that was able to really create logistically a way to carry this out. Just ideas for integrating this into the real world of agency care.
Yeah. I think I can go ahead and answer that, Nietzsche and Hugo. So in my practice over the last probably 10 years, I worked in community agency settings. And sometimes, so they were done in one of two ways. And so my first agent setting was in Oakland and San Francisco, where there were, in the setting itself, there were shared offices. And a lot of these shared offices had already play materials there, art materials there that were kind of shared amongst the clinicians, and were brought in specifically to tailor the developmental needs of children who had experienced trauma and with their families. And so a lot of there is a lot of thought process that goes into play and art materials and what you purchase or what you bring into the office and what you have accessible for children, because sometimes it can be quite overwhelming and sometimes even triggering if there's too much. And so really kind of learning a little bit more about the structure of our materials, the size of paper to get. Smaller size papers will provide more containment and safety for a parent and child. Bigger size papers are for like adolescents. And so if you have a 15, 16-year-old, you might want to bring out a roll of paper, and that allows for more expression in a safe way. And so really, these are just kind of some examples of what to look for, what to leave out. And of course, there is prep and there is cleanup time. And so in my practice in agency settings, and then even in an agency sitting here in Spokane, Washington, where I had my own office, I still needed to build in time for prep and time for cleanup. Prep was a little easier because I had a very structured format to the office where certain materials were covered or put away and certain materials were left out purposefully because I knew what was going to happen or what I could expect from a client coming in with their parent. And then the cleanup time would usually be with the child involved and parent. And that was part of the treatment. And so really helping the child kind of feel more engaged in not just the art experience, but in cleaning and organizing, planning things out, life skills in general, that they could be supported by their parents in that. And that would often save time. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but yeah.
No, that helps a lot. And were you able to do that within kind of the 50-minute counseling hour, or did you find it was helpful to get 90 minutes or more sometimes, or?
The 50-minute was just fine for a parent and child. If I had a family that was larger than 4 people, then I would have a 90-minute hour or 120.
Gotcha. Yeah,
Yes.
that makes a lot of sense. Okay, thank you so much. That helps a lot to get the juices flowing.
Great. Thank you so much for that question. And I'm just noting that we're just at time. So I just wanted to thank everyone so much for being here. We really, really appreciate your thoughtful engagement and questions, and a huge thank you to our incredible presenters. This is just a fabulous webinar, and we're so grateful for you sharing your expertise with us. So if, Joanne, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So again, here's their contact information. This information will all be sent out to you as a slide deck. And then if you want to go to one more slide as well. Thank you so much. So again, please, if you have a moment now or sometime in the next week or so, we'd love if you could fill out our webinar evaluations that we can improve our webinars for the future. And then also feel free to reach out to us at our email, which is listed on this slide down here. If you have any questions, any follow-up, any thoughts, but we're super thankful to have you here, and we hope to see you at parts 2 through 4 of this 4-part webinar series, which is in developmental order. So our next presentation is on December 2nd, and it's focused on kind of middle-aged children, so 5 to 12 years old, and additionally focused on family-based interventions for that developmental stage. So thank you all so much. We'll hang out here a little bit longer in case you have any other questions, but I hope you have a great rest of your Monday.
I just put a Facebook link on there for everybody. That's a public page that we share information about infant and early childhood mental health offerings, presentations, trainings, anything that you want to share there, you can. It's an open public Facebook page. Trying to build the infant and early childhood mental health community in Washington State.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.